Hi, everybody.
Welcome to our Ecology, Not Theology, the Green God's Gospel series. We're on session number 4, and we're exploring the parables in the Gospel of Matthew and their ecological teachings. Today we have a very famous parable, and again, you can go back and listen to the earlier sessions we've done. We're trying to recreate what it was like to be experiencing these stories orally in the context of Second Temple period Palestine. So Clark today will share the parable, but it's your job to imagine you're, sitting around a fire outdoors on the ground, surrounded by plants whose names you know, listening to birds whose names you know and whose songs you recognize, and listening to a storyteller who shares the following piece of wisdom with you. Wisdom that he's received from the natural world, wisdom that is available to all of us, whether or not we can read or write, from the natural world. Jesus is not interpreting Scripture. Jesus is sharing what he's noticed in the earth.
The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof.
So, one of the things the church often does with the teachings of Jesus is it turns them into metaphors. Jesus isn't talking about mustard seeds. Jesus isn't talking about birds. He's really talking about the church,
right.
Faith. Heaven,
right.
Appropriate behavior.
Right.
This is what heaven is really like. And an effort is made to distance from the ecological reality of this story. So Clark can share with you kind of what would be the standard interpretation. You may have even heard the sermon at some point in your life.
Well, one is just the irresistibility of the kingdom, right? The fact that it can start very small, but it spreads and it grows. The gospel spreads and grows, right? So it's a sort of a triumphalist look at the gospel and how it is, how salvation is spread from one person to another.
Your
right?
faith starts small, and your faith will spread and grow and get bigger and bigger.
Right. Also, the early Christians, according to the way the church looks at it, the birds that come and lodge in the branches, right, are like Gentiles, or like non-Jewish converts to Christianity. So it's all about the growth of the institution.
But let's look at mustard seeds, because Jesus says mustard seed, and it's an important detail. And mustard seeds are very tiny, very, very tiny. He says that they're very small. But mustard seeds to a Galilean farmer were an invasive species.
Last thing you wanted to plant in your field.
These were the weeds. So the last parable was about the tares in the wheat. What do you do about the weeds? Don't weed, says Jesus. Now he's got a parable that is only about a weed.
Right.
And it's almost a kind of tongue-in-cheek. There's often a lot of humor in Jesus' storytelling that gets lost in the sort of piety and the need to ignore it, which is, the humor is no farmer is going out there to plant mustard seeds.
So Jesus is, the first hearers of this parable are scratching their heads and going, what, a farmer actually planted a mustard seed?
Nobody plants mustard seeds.
Why would he do that? Why would he want to do that?
Nobody would plant a mustard seed. And in fact, one of the invasive species in the Catskills right now is garlic mustard. It pops up everywhere. It can grow anywhere. It grows everywhere. Everybody's pulling it out of their garden. It is actually delicious this time of year and quite good for you in a liver tonic. Which brings us to talking about invasive species. Because Jesus is deliberately talking about something that everybody wants to get rid of. And he says, this is the kingdom of heaven. That which grows up, no matter what you do, that which gets planted and you don't make any effort to plant it, that's the kingdom of heaven.
Right. That which occurs spontaneously and grows spontaneously.
Effortless.
Yeah.
It is not hard to grow garlic mustard in the Catskills. It grows. You don't have to plant it. You don't have to do anything. You just have to go outside and pick some garlic mustard. There it is. Same with Japanese knotweed, which is taking over, which is an invasive species. It grows everywhere. Here's the problem with invasive species is we create an idea in our heads as human beings of what nature is supposed to look like. and then we impose that order onto the natural world.
Yeah.
The most obvious way we would do that is with farming. We should be eating just one kind of food, wheat or corn or barley.
Right.
We're going to just plant wheat or corn or barley. And the weeds are the bad problem that makes it hard to grow our wheat or corn or barley. We're going to eat one kind of animal, chickens or pigs or cows. And any animal, wolf or a coyote that comes and kills our chickens is a bad animal. So we create this dichotomous world of that which is good for humans and that which is bad for a human-managed ecosystem.
And in fact, in what we call invasive species are just species of plant or animal that come into a disrupted or disturbed ecosystem in an effort to fill a niche that's been left, right, in order to put life where there wasn't any life before.
So you don't get invasive species in healthy ecosystems. A healthy ecosystem is filling every available area for growth and vitality. And the ecosystem is by its nature entangled and working in this kind of ecstatic, efflorescent way. But when human beings come in and decide we're going to cut down all the trees and grow a single crop, suddenly there's space for new species to move in. There's space for the mustard seed because the farmer has decided that he only wants to grow one kind of seed. And nature says, I don't grow only one kind of seed. I grow a lot of seeds.
So there's a sly nod in this parable, right, to the people of Jesus' day, because basically what it's offering is a kind of a critique of institutional religion, right? It's saying that this is the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus teaches it, right, is something that comes into the well-tended and ordered field of institutional religion. It would have been the Judaism of Jesus' day,
or
right?
the paganism, whatever,
Or
the Roman
whatever.
Empire, or anything.
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful that we don't turn this parable into our own metaphor, but we
Right.
go to nature itself to look for its
Right.
own teaching.
But he says it comes in and it takes root, right? And it grows and you can't stop it, right?
But people are always trying to stop it. And that's one of the things about invasive species. Modern conservation is in a desperate war in America with invasive species, whether it's Japanese barberry or Japanese knotweed or garlic mustard or any other number, what are they? They're kind of mussels that are coming in that are invasive now. But one of the things that's fascinating, for instance, like the mussels, I forget which kind it is that's invasive, but there used to be 100 different varieties of mussels in America. And they got wiped out. They went extinct. So there was a niche that opened up. And this invasive mussels comes in and says, nobody's doing the work of mussels. I guess I better I better start doing it. Just like the garlic mustard comes in and says, oh, nobody's doing this job with the soil. My turn to do it. The kudzu down south is actually cleaning the heavy metals out of the soil. And so a lot of times human beings will look at an invasive species and say, oh my gosh, we can't create the natural Eden we imagine. Nature is creating a different Eden and has a different program. And I think, in fact, Jesus is saying that in this parable because the Eden that is created by the mustard seed is not for human beings. The seed, he says, that it's like a mustard seed which becomes a tree where the birds of the air come and make their homes. So the mustard seed is good for the birds.
It's one of our sort of unofficial slogans on Way of the Rose. Our Lady never does just one thing, right? And nature never does just one thing. So it causes this plant to grow, but the plant is also providing a home for the birds. The birds come, live in that home, and their droppings then nurture the soil.
With other
seeds.
seeds.
With other seeds that nurtures the plant, right?
And that are going to naturally replenish the seeds. We've forgotten that the natural world provides its own fertilizer in the form of animals, right? They're all, in fact, one of the reasons the American chestnut trees went extinct in the early part of the 20th century, and one of the reasons it's hypothesized they went extinct is because they used to be fertilized by the passenger pigeons, thousands, millions of passenger pigeons, billions, and they would come through these forests, sweeping in to eat the chestnuts, and leaving behind their droppings, which were food for the trees, and replenish them. So the next year they came through, there would be more chestnuts. And what happens with human beings is we say, we have an idea. We're going to pull out all the weeds. No birds come. No fertilizer comes. The fields get tired. And we wonder why everything is going wrong and going to hell. Now, it's really, really hard because what also the mustard seed is telling us is things change. Things are unpredictable. You know, the mustard seed is not something that is good, seemingly good for human beings.
And you know, one of the things about Jesus' parables about seeds, especially parables about plants and animals, is that they don't offer a portrait of the kingdom of heaven that is based on purity. It's like we think of like heaven as being, well, it's like pure white clouds in the sky, golden sunlight, singing angels, and all that, right? Maybe all one kind of people, right? People tend to, you know, depending on their religion or their ethnicity, tend to imagine a heaven that looks like them, right? But this isn't, you know, Jesus doesn't have any truck with the purity police, right? His portrait of heaven is always a little messy, right? It's got tares and it's got wheat. It's got mustard seeds that come in and grow up like weeds everywhere and bring in a lot of birds. The farmers also, by the way, don't love the birds, right? Because the birds come in and eat their crops, right? So his portrait of the kingdom of heaven is counterintuitive for a lot of people. People who are very committed to practicing agriculture, industry, empire. His definition of the kingdom is disruptive to that. Jesus has a very disruptive idea of the kingdom of heaven from a purely human point of view.
Absolutely. His kingdom is not, you know, we often say, you know, what's good, what's bad. We are often defining good or bad in terms of, is it good for human beings? And Jesus is not so interested. He says that the whole thing is a lot more complicated and messy. And
let's go back to the beginning of that idea. You know, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's that, you know, the garden where Adam and Eve live, which, you know, includes all the plants and animals. Is a perfectly beautiful working ecosystem. And the one thing they're not supposed to do is to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? This has been so highly moralized and connected to sex and things like that in the minds of the church fathers that it's easy to lose sight of what it probably originally meant, which is good and bad. Good for who? The moment you assert some absolute good, it has to be good for something or someone. And if you look at the very earliest history of human beings practicing agriculture, it's all based on one single idea, is what is good for human beings. What allows human beings the greatest food security? What allows human beings to control the land on which they live? What allows them to dominate other species of plant and animals and bend them to their will, right? What's good for humans?
And in fact, it's a very short-sighted vision because we organize the world to be good for us as human beings, our species, and we have fashioned a world, created a world, imposed our will on a world, and it's not so good for us after all. In fact, it's a terrible world for us. We've never been sicker, we've never been lonelier, we've never been more anxious, and in fact, we find ourselves, our species, we are on the brink of a massive extinction event, and I think it needs to be talked about.
Yeah. And we actually don't, and this appears again and again in Jesus' teachings as well as ecological teachings. We, as human beings, don't ultimately really know what is good for us, right? We have an idea about that, and you know, you would think that you know, the greater good, right, would be a guiding principle. But look at, you know, the greater good is used, you know, it's one of the building blocks of utilitarian approach to society and social engineering. Look at all the injustice that has caused, right?
Or even, I'm going to go back to an invasive species. There's a species called Japanese knotweed where we live. It's an invasive species. It's taken over these really industrial wastelands by the side of the road, by the side of ditches. It moves in, it takes over. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do about the Japanese knotweed? It just grows like a weed. It's happy anywhere. It grows. You don't have to cultivate it. You don't have to fertilize it. You don't have to tend it. It'll grow. Mm-hmm. It has arrived, Japanese knotweed, along with another invasive species, which has been, because the woodlands have been so cut back, it's created the perfect area for Lyme disease,
Right.
deer ticks. The deer have come closer to human habitation, and they bring with them a form of illness in the deer ticks. But the best treatment for Lyme disease is Japanese knotweed.
Yeah, best natural treatment. Yeah,
The best natural treatment. We both treated our Lyme disease with Japanese knotweed. And in fact, the earth is offering healing and a solution to our problems if we only knew. And I think often in the modern conservation movement, what we see is we would like to conserve an idea of what's best for nature rather than to trust. I often say, a lot of people are, pro-choice, particularly on Way of the Rose. Are we pro-choice when it comes to what the earth does with her body? Do we trust her to make the right choices for her body? And that may not look very nice to us. It may be an invasive species. It might be a swarm of locusts. Right. It might be an algal bloom that's going to transform the ecosystem. The problem is we see things in a very small time frame, and the earth sees things in a very long time frame.
So let's look at this and say, well, how do we actually put this into practice? If we can't trust the idea of the greater good or the human good, right? If we've reached a point, in our evolution as a species where the idea of the human good has run up against the limits of the planet, right? So that every further attempt to increase the greater good for human beings actually depletes natural resources and degrades our environment, so that ultimately it isn't good for us at all. What is the right course of action in the face of that? Our Lady calls it the heart's desire. Following the heart's desire is a very, very different idea than trying to calculate the good and to set the good against the evil, right? Heart's desire never addresses the questions of good or evil, right? It goes right to what is most life-affirming, right? What is most wholesome, most nurturing, what is sweetest and feels kindness and most loving.
And that means that you sit outside and there's a tree and it's filled with birds and the birds are singing and Jesus' audience is sitting on the ground listening to the birds and the music of the birds all around them and singing and going, well, this is the kingdom of heaven. This is good, right?
And it's this endless fight. Basically what he's inviting them to do is to give up this endless fight, right? This no-win situation, this endless war against the earth, right? He says the kingdom of heaven is not the well-tended, perfectly pure, perfectly well-ordered field filled with some monoculture crop, right? The kingdom of heaven is the thing that comes in, that naturally wants to come into that space and fill it instead and create biodiversity and beauty and variety, right?
And it's natural.
You don't have to fight it. You don't have to struggle against that. You don't have to pit your good against that good, right?
And in fact, it's advice about our heart's desire, finally, which is it's planted there. You don't have to work. You don't have to try to grow an invasive species. An invasive species is going to grow. All you have to do is let it grow, and it will bring the birds. And if we want to take it into ourselves, into our own spiritual practice, there are desires within us that are as natural, and they may look like a weed to us. They may not conform to our idea of the perfect, pure.
Way of the Rose, our fellowship, as we've seen a few times, when
we're a bit of an invasive species.
We're a bit of an invasive species, and the more conventional religious people tend to view us that way, right? But we're coming in and filling a space. There's a lot of space left in people's lives.
The biggest growing religious group in America, spiritual but not religious, and they're there because they're fed up. We talk about the kudzu comes in because the soil has become toxic, right? And it's there to kind of clean the soil and get things growing again.
Non-hierarchical religion comes into a society that has been filled with people whose hearts have been decimated by hierarchical authoritarian religion.
And we say, let the mustard seeds there begin to grow. It's no effort. It's no toil. It's no big deal. This has all been taken care of. Biodiversity will happen if we just let it happen.
Yeah, the kingdom of heaven happens on its own, right?
It-
Programs for creating it, not so good.
Not so good. All right, everybody. That was our fourth session
Yep.
on ecology,
5 more
not
to
theology.
go.
5 more to go. You can find them all in the featured posts on Way of the Rose, and ultimately we'll get them all up on the website, of course. Thanks so much. This is in our devotion to St. Matthew, whose feast day we are celebrating on April 15th.
Tax day.
Tax day.
Because he was an accountant.
Thank you all, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.